A new Russia begins in 1812. Alexander Ivanovich Herzen. In St. Petersburg, in the Winter Palace, there is a military gallery dedicated to the Patriotic War of 1812. It features 332 portraits of Russian generals. However, if you look closely at the generals presented, you can notice that almost half of them have English, German, and even French surnames. These surnames are highlighted in yellow. Despite the fact that for most of them, the place of birth and death is shamefully hushed up, you can find that some of them were born in a European country and also died somewhere in Western Europe, probably having fulfilled their duty to our fatherland. This painting shows generals, heroes of the War of 1812, who excel. All wear medals on their chest. And besides Russian awards, there are also European awards. Let's look at these awards in more detail. General of Infantry Pyotr Ivanovich Bagration. Here I am only showing the orders of countries against which, according to the official version, the Russian generals fought. On Bagration, we see 1 Austrian and 2 Prussian orders. At the same time, the Order of the Black Eagle was a chivalric order. That is, essentially, Bagration swore loyal, honorable service to the Prussian knightly order. How could he go to war against the Prussian king after that? General of Cavalry Matvei Ivanovich Plotov. He has 2 Austrian and 2 Prussian orders. He was also a knight of the Prussian royal house. Field Marshal Mikhail Illarionovich Golenischev-Kutuzov of Smolensk. He has few European awards, 1 Austrian order and 2 Prussian ones. But at the same time, he was also a knight of the Prussian royal house. Note that we can observe some of these awards on Kutuzov's chest. Despite the fact that according to the official version, Russia was at war with France, and countries like Prussia and Austria were allies of France and also took part in military actions against Russia, the generals did not hesitate to wear the orders of these countries when sitting for the portrait. Field Marshal Michael Andreas Barclay de Tolly, a man with a frankly French surname. Until August 24, 1812, he held the position of Minister of War of the Russian Empire. In addition to Prussian and Austrian orders, he also has 2 French orders. And he also had the Order of St. Louis. Thus Barclay de Tolly was a French knight. General of Infantry Mikhail Andreevich Miloradovich. He also has Austrian and Prussian orders. But at the same time, he was also a knight of the Prussian royal house. Emperor of all Russia. King of Poland, Grand Duke of Finland, Protector of the Order of Malta, Alexander I Pavlovich. He has more foreign awards than other generals. It should be noted that he had 2 French knightly orders. Among them was the Order of the Holy Spirit, which was awarded to the highest nobility and clergy. In the comments to the first part of the film, I received several reproaches for not considering documents and manuscripts related to the First Patriotic War. Russian State Library made an 1812 war site. Also, a manuscript section. Unsearchable PDFs. Few docs. And I will read out the most significant of them. You can always go to this site and read these documents yourself. Manifesto of Emperor Alexander, the 1st of June 25, 1812. This manifesto was issued in connection with the outbreak of the war. The manifesto was written by the hand of a certain Tolstoy N.A. and signed by Alexander I. Despite being aimed at the army, the manifesto was, for some reason, written in French. And why not in Russian?
Next document. Decree addressing the troops, dated February 5, 1813, by Alexander I. It is written that the document is presented in a printed translation from Russian into French. But where is the copy in Russian? Why aren't they showing us this original? The General Staff's newspaper Kila of the Russian Army, published in 1813, shown as a manuscript, again in French. The question, which I will repeat once more, was that Army Russia? Finally, a Russian document. It is titled The Justification of the Commander-in-Chief Barclay de Tolly for his actions during the patriotic war with the French in 1812. It details the impossibility of a general battle in the war's early stages, the need for orderly preparation for this battle, and the Russian army's retreat to Tsarevo-Zaymishchi. It would seem that here is the document that reveals the main mystery of the Russian troops' behavior in the War of 1812. However, upon closer examination, it turns out that the document was completed in December 1821. But, as we know from Barclay de Tolly's biography, he died in 1818. So, did Mikhail Undries write this document, or was the document written in full much later, after his death? Also included is a letter from Kutuzov to Gavrila Petrovich Yermolov. Not Alexei Petrovich Yermolov, the famed war hero and Caucasus liberator, but his uncle, who was an ensign in the Guards. This letter is dated as late as 1865. It's quite possible this note was added by Gavrila Petrovich's son. This letter isn't as important as one would hope to see. Where is the correspondence between Alexander I and Napoleon? Where is Kutuzov's correspondence with Napoleon or with Alexander I? Another document presented here in Russian is called Report of General of Infantry Barclay de Tolly to Emperor Alexander I on the movement of the army in 1812. It says, the document gives an intriguing account of Moscow's loss, blaming external factors in commanding Russian forces, who, by higher order, were taken from Barclay de Tolly's command. Initially, I thought I had finally found a report that was published in 1812, right during the war and in Russia. However, at the end of the manuscript, there is an excerpt from a poem by Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin, which he wrote in 1835. Later came the manuscript. Again, relation unclear. Alexander Sergeyevich dedicated this poem to Barclay de Tolly. I will now read you the cited excerpt. I ask you to reflect on the meaning of this excerpt. Unlucky leader, all to foreign soil, impenetrable to the gaze of the wild mob, in silence you walked alone with a great thought, and disliking the foreign sound in your name, pursuing you with their shouts. The people, mysteriously saved by you, mocked your sacred gray hair. As is clear from the cited excerpt, both writers and poets of that time were all aware of this situation with the First Patriotic War of 1812, but they were forbidden to tell the truth. In the video description, I will put a link to this page, and you can see for yourselves that there are very few significant manuscripts from the War of 1812 here. One gets the impression that only those letters that confirm the official version have been left. In part 1 of War of the Worlds 1812, I showed Napoleon's and Alexander I's army uniforms match. In the film's comments, even opponents admitted uniform color wasn't a distinguishing mark between the armies, and this is indeed so, as it was a unified uniform for a unified imperial army. The central idea was to hide that the armies had fought on the same side. Much later, green uniforms were credited to Russian divisions, and blue to the French, Prussian, Austrians, Pole, and others. Examples: 1812 battle. Russians, French, obvious. Russians in green. Another example: Grande Armée Ops, August 21st, 1812. The troops are marked in green and blue. Obviously, the colors were not chosen by chance. The map I have already shown. The plan of the battle at the village of Borodino. Blue, French, green, Russians. Clearly, troop colors followed uniform hues, later widely used to classify units. And such examples could go on endlessly. Modern painting. French navy, Russians green. And why didn't the artist draw all the soldiers in uniforms of the same color? This is an image of a mounted Jaeger in dress uniform, shown almost with his back to us. To which army does this soldier belong? The French or the Russian? In fact, this Jaeger belongs to the French army, despite the uniform being green in color. So how could they fight against each other with such similar uniforms? The French army before 1812 was dressed in old-style blue uniforms. This uniform consisted of a frock coat with long tails, buttoned up to the middle of the chest, which revealed the waistcoat worn by the serviceman. In spring 1812, the emperor decreed a new green uniform model for the French army to wear. It was a jacket that buttoned to the waist and hid the vest. This uniform's tails were 22 centimeters shorter than the old models. However, the decree didn't cover the Imperial Guard. All guardsmen, except the newly formed regiment of Guard Grenadier Flankers, kept wearing the old pattern uniforms until, indeed, the end of Napoleonic era. Naturally, before the invasion of Russia, industry did not have time to re-outfit the entire, numerous Napoleonic army, and most of the French regiments fought in Russia in old-style uniforms. After the Grande Army's defeat and destruction, new regiments were promptly issued 1,812 pattern uniforms. But because they were scarce, old uniform stock was used. Plus, rear and reserve units joining the army fought in whatever uniforms they had. Thus, until the very collapse of the Napoleonic Empire, the French army used both old and new style uniforms. I also found this image of a Russian uniform with a description in French. In the upper left, a Jaeger is depicted in a rather unusual headdress. This hat is not typical for Russian troops. However, it was precisely such headdresses that were used in the War of 1812 in North America. The War of 1812 left behind monuments that support the version that Russian troops fought alongside French troops on the same side. Near Smolensk, monument to General Desclans, officially killed defending it. It is written that the general was buried by the French on March 8, 1812, in the royal bastion in the presence of Emperor Napoleon with full military honors. Apparently, Napoleon learned that the general had a French surname and decided to be personally present at his burial. Not far from the Bolshoi Vyazymy estate, there is a monument with a rather strange inscription on it. It is written that the monument was erected in memory of the halt of the Russian and French armies in August 1812. Kutuzov's grave in the Kazan Cathedral. The grave is topped with a French eagle, which is placed on an icon. According to legend, it was to this icon that Mikhail Illarionovich prayed. To the left and right of the grave are not the Russian flags under which he fought, but French flags topped with the French eagle. It is officially considered that these are captured flags. Kutuzov's oddities don't end here. In the book titled Napoleon, the story of a great commander, which was published in St. Petersburg and Moscow in 1912, there is a photograph captioned, "Kutuzov's is born near Moscow." Kutuzov hid here. Napoleon in Moscow. Apparently, this Izbal was later turned into a museum. The most interesting thing is that on the right side of the photograph, we see a portrait not of Alexander I or Peter I, but of Napoleon Bonaparte. This is a famous portrait by Della Rocca. The photograph was taken much later, but it never even occurred to anyone to take this portrait down. So what other proof do you need that Kutuzov fought on Napoleon's side? This painting depicts the monument at the site of the French crossing in the village of Studenka in 1812. The monument bears profiles of Alexander I and Napoleon. True, the portraits have been changed now. How they looked before is shown on another page in this book. We see both emperors depicted as marble. Both were Roman wreaths. Hard to tell them apart. That they are indeed those emperors is clear only from the caption below the drawing. According to history, it was at this place that Alexander's army dealt a significant blow to the French army and essentially destroyed it. Without this history, looking at emperors' profiles, such an idea rarely occurs. Both rulers appear fully equal, just like on dozens of other monuments and medals. Obviously, even 100 years later, perceptions of the War of 1812 were completely different. Also, here is an excerpt that relates to the period when Napoleon captured Moscow. It is written, Alexander I never began peace talks. Napoleon personally wrote the Tsar, lamenting the devastating fire in Moscow. An answer. Tsar trusted a ghost. He ignored his generals, repeating, Providence. Napoleon or me. Why was this said at all? Could Napoleon and Alexander really not share power? Caption. Alexander I chose Napoleon Bashkirs, Kalmyks, and other native troops. July 7th, 1807. Well, first of all, can you call the army Russian if almost half of the generals were foreigners? And Alexander I himself addressed them in French. If in this painting Alexander introduced Napoleon to Bashkirs, Kalmyks, Cossacks, etc., why is he standing opposite instead? And one more point. It is immediately striking that the presented non-Russian peoples are wearing headgear, just like Napoleon and Alexander I. The other officers are standing without headgear. If all these, as it is said, non-Russian peoples really served in the Russian army, then why did they not uncover their heads in the presence of the supreme ruler? Therefore, looking at this painting, we conclude figures of equal rank met. I believe that this captures the last meeting of representatives of the Western and Eastern worlds. And here we see Khans of various kingdoms. Apparently, the sides failed to agree, and that day Alexander I signed the Tilsit Peace with Napoleon. And 5 years later, the war began. In the first part, I showed John James' book, which is called Journal of a Tour in Germany, Sweden, Russia, and Poland. There I provided a detailed description of how Napoleon blew up the Kremlin. I found a French illustration that is titled The Explosion of the Kremlin. Official history says the retreating army burned Moscow. Yet several sources already suggest that's probably not true, that events likely unfolded differently, and this allows us to doubt the official version. Was the Kremlin really blown up? Is there any other confirmation of this fact? In the book titled Materials for the History of Emperor Alexander I and His Era, Medal, Alexander I is St. George, mounted, spear's beast. Left arm, shield, all-seeing eye, 1812, blown up Kremlin afar. Apparently, the medal was not approved, although it would have been interesting to see it. This book contains several designs for medals featuring Alexander I slaying a serpent. Apparently, this idea was later abandoned. In place of Alexander I, they put an image of an unknown youth, and it was identified as St. George the Victorious. And the composition of the painting was borrowed from another famous painting of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon tried destroying one in Moscow. In the document titled Kremlin Towers and Walls,
existing and destroyed by the enemy in 1815. I found the following image of the Kremlin wall. On the roof of the tower is placed not the cross we are used to, but an incomprehensible structure. What is it? Note the title. Apparently, deliberate destruction wasn't secret. And here's another similar document showing a different tower. At the top, we also see an odd pattern. Proponents of atmospheric electricity might say that this is an antenna for receiving static electricity from the atmosphere. It is known that Count Kutuzov corresponded with Napoleon through his aide-de-camp, Lauriston, when the French captured Moscow. According to the official version, the partisan movement was very strong. People caught Frenchmen who walked alone or fell behind their units. No ceremony with French. Napoleon to Kutuzov. Proposal says. In a note by Lauriston on September 23rd, he urged ending the People's War, which, stirred and backed by partisans, inflicted great losses on foes. The field marshal replied, "The people understand this war as an invasion of the Tatars and, therefore, consider any means of ridding themselves of the enemies not only unobjectionable, but commendable and sacred." A very strange request from Napoleon, as the commander of an army that was destroying the cities and villages of Russia. But if you look at this situation from another perspective, when the army led by Kutuzov and the army led by Napoleon were fighting on the same side, then everything falls into place. Naturally, the people resisted the invaders, and Napoleon turned to a Russian-speaking general in the hope that he would negotiate with people who also spoke Russian to stop their resistance. On another page in this book, the author tries to explain the following statement, which was already incomprehensible 50 years after the war. Advancing on Moscow, no enemy behind Napoleon. You can read for yourself what explanations the author provided. I suggest you familiarize yourself with the evidence that Napoleon had no enemy in his rear anywhere. In a French newspaper, which was called Journal de l'Empire, and which described the events of the war in the East, I found the following note. All the flags that were taken by the Russians in various wars from the Turks, as well as the statistical information they took from the Kremlin, were sent to Paris. They just sent valuable intel to the rear. But a fair question arises. What was valuable in this information? Flags? Statistics? It's quite possible that these were valuable witnesses to Moscow's true past. Almost all paintings depicting Napoleon's campaign to Moscow show Napoleon on horseback, confirming that it was a military campaign in the general sense. However, the Paris Museum preserves the carriage in which Napoleon traveled to Moscow and back. It's a great pity that the museum does not specify how many times Napoleon traveled to Moscow and back in this carriage. One of the dark spots of the War of 1812 is the question, why did Prince Golenischev Kutuzov receive the title of Smolensky? In the book titled The Depiction of the Military Actions of 1812, the work is attributed to Barclay de Tolly. A decree with the text for granting this title is provided. It says the following. In memory of the unforgettable merits of our General Field Marshal, Prince Golenischev Kutuzov, who brought the numerous enemy troops to complete exhaustion, extermination, and flight through his skillful maneuvers and repeated victories, especially for delivering a heavy defeat to the enemy near Smolensk, which was followed by the liberation of this famous city and the hasty removal from Russia of the pursued enemies, we grant him the title of Smolensky. Obviously, this refers to the Battle of Krasnoy, which took place from November 15th to 1812. However, this battle took place 45 kilometers from Smolensk, and according to the official version, the retreating French army did not really defend the city. So what kind of liberation can we be talking about? And yet for such a merit the title of Smolensky was granted. By the same token, one could have bestowed the title of Borodino or of Moscow. Obviously, Kutuzov already had this title. The official version is just trying somehow to explain this fact. Here, why Kutuzov got the Order of St. George, first class. It is written, after serving the Divine Liturgy, the grateful monarch, with all his retinue, having come to General Field Marshal Prince Golenishev Kutuzov of Smolensk, deigned to make him, for the famous deeds by which he liberated Russia from the shameful yoke of foreigners, a Knight of the Military Order of the Holy Great Martyr and Victorious St. George, first class. In Russia, the shameful yoke always referred to what was later called the Mongol-Tatar yoke. Comparing the French army's march along the Smolensk road is more than absurd, especially since Napoleon hadn't yet imposed any yoke. I think few would argue with that. But according to this note, the yoke in Russia really fell only in 1812. One of the puzzling stories of the War of 1812 is Napoleon's expectation of some boyars near Moscow. Which boyars? Napoleon? Officially, Russia had none. In the French painting called The Entry of the French Army under the command of Emperor Napoleon into the city of Moscow, we see precisely these boyars. Pay attention to these people's clothes and headwear. The painting shows Napoleon entering the city with an orchestra. Overall, the painting amounts to a theater of the absurd. City residents flooded the streets to greet the French, even as the city's towers burned and crumbled amid a raging fire. Was the artist an eyewitness to this event? Obviously not. Moscow is depicted in a very European style. Apparently, the artists painted pictures based on events that were described to them. And such paintings give reason to believe that there really were some boyars, and it is quite possible that they committed treason and opened the gates to Napoleon. Another painting, called The Entry of the French into Moscow. Why did French artists persistently depict events in their paintings that diverge from the version described in our textbooks? Here, too, the city looks very European. On the tower, we see something that resembles an antenna rather than a cross. In 1869, the French cartographer and explorer Charles Joseph Minard drew a map showing the reduction in the strength of the Grande Army, which still causes a lot of controversy. According to this map, 422,000 soldiers entered Russia. But the same map shows the army began vanishing before frost, during retreat to Paris. For example, after Vitebsk, only 175,000 remained. After Smolensk, just 145,000 men. Officially, in the Battle of Smolensk, 14,000 soldiers on the French side were killed or wounded. Where did the remaining 16,000 go then? After the Battle of Smolensk, according to this map, Napoleon lost 2/3 of his army. How could he then advance further, deeper into enemy territory? Only 100,000 reached Moscow, under 1/4 of the army. Minard's map gives reason to state that Napoleon's army dissolved in Russia. Let's see if there is any confirmation that this could be true. In the book titled Historical Essays and Articles Relating to the Year 1812, which was published for the centenary of the war, the author provides a description of a meeting with the last of the veterans of the Grande Army. It tells of a certain lieutenant, Nikolai Andreevich Savin, who participated in the Egyptian campaign with Napoleon, and in 1812 came to Russia with the Grande Army. It says that on the return, near the Berezina, his unit was defeated. Cossacks captured him, and Plotov saved him from lynching. He stayed. Russia, his second home. Not Dnieper, Saratov. And this fact once again confirms the theory that Napoleon did reach the Volga. Nicholas Andreas Savin died in 1894 at the age of 126. Of course, There is some doubt here that this soldier could have lived so long. Most likely, he served in the Crimean War. Napoleon III participated. But that's a slightly different story. Why? 100 years later, they tried to find veterans of the War of 1812. Yule's village is named for European capitals. The village of Paris even has its own Eiffel Tower. These names were given by Cossacks who took part in the wars of 1799, as well as the wars of 1813 to 1814, and who were sent to serve in western Siberia. Could these Cossacks have been French? This painting depicts the enlistment of captured Poles from Napoleon's army into the Cossacks in 1813. Karamzin's drawing depicts the moment the Polish prisoners arrive in Omsk, after they, already assigned to Cossack regiments under the supervision of the Siberian Cossack host Rittmeister Saul Nabokov, change into Cossack uniforms one by one.